Hi, today I want to tell you about the greatest story ever. And this is the story of our salvation, of God's salvation for us. One thing is, God created us, and He created us not for His sake, but for our sake. He created us for a reason, and we do have a destiny. And when God made us, He wasn't thinking about the origin of our creation, but He was thinking about the end of the creation. That is, He was thinking of where He wanted to lead us. And where He wanted to lead us is to Him. God made us because He knew that we will be happy with Him. God made us to guide us to Him. As the old catechism would say, He made us to know Him, to serve Him, and to love Him. So at the very beginning, when God made man and woman, He made us with that goal in mind, to always be at His side so that we would walk next to Him. And He made us a race in our forefathers, our foreparents, Adam and Eve. And through them, He wanted to grow us into a race that will always be with Him. But here is the problem. We messed up. We messed up from the very beginning. In fact, if we look at the story of creation, that loving, selfless story of creation in which God made the whole universe, and finally the crown jewel, which is humanity. That takes 2 chapters of Genesis, the first 2 chapters of the Bible. And in chapter 3, we already mess up. So the rest of the Bible, essentially, the rest of the 73 books of the Bible essentially tell us the story, that wonderful story of love through which God guides us back to Him. Now, when we fail, that is, when we separated ourselves from God, that's when something went really, really, really wrong. And at the bottom of it, the problem was that we didn't trust Him. In fact, we trusted ourselves more than we trusted Him. We thought that we ourselves could decide what is good and what is evil. We thought that we had the capacity to define what is good and what is evil. We decided not to serve, but to be served. And the bottom line, we decided to be God. That's it. We decided to be God. So, and when we did that, we actually broke the most beautiful, the most perfect, the most natural balance that existed in creation, which is that He is God and we are not. And that brought consequences. Trust became distrust. Knowledge became ignorance. And love became pride. But even after that huge mess up, God did not abandon us. In fact, in the same chapter 3 of Genesis, right there at the beginning, in the fall of man, God already promises to us to bring a Savior. He makes a promise that to give us hope that even though we failed big time, even though we fail big time, He would raise us up again. And in order to save creation, God would enter creation. He decided that in order to save us, He would enter into our here and our now, into our space and our time. He didn't wait for us to reach all the way up to the heights where He was, because there was too much of a gap. So He stooped down and entered into our history. So as we humans were limping through history, broken, God stooped down and entered that same history. God revealed Himself to us. God Himself created a bridge that would span the great chasm that we had created, the great chasm of our distrust, the great chasm of our pride. So He revealed Himself, but He did so gradually. He did so gradually to give humanity time to absorb that knowledge of God, to give humanity time to learn to trust in Him, and therefore to learn to love Him. And He did so in a gradual way, so that at the fullness of time, He could breach that gap, that chasm that our pride created, by stretching His own arms and fill the gap. So, but at everything that is done right, it takes time. So God slowly but surely started revealing Himself to us. And so He started that way. First with Adam, and came the fall. But after that, with Noah. And in Noah, He revealed Himself to a family, to Noah's wife, sons, and daughters-in-law. You see? And at that moment, He brought a flood. Now, why the flood? He brought the flood not to destroy humanity, but to cleanse humanity and to bring it up again, now in a family, in Noah's family. And so He did. And then humanity started growing again. Started growing again, multiplying. And then came Abraham. And in Abraham, our father in faith, God entered into another covenant, just as He had done with Noah. In Noah's covenant, God had promised not to destroy humanity ever. And in Abraham's covenant, God promised to bless all nations through him. You see, with Abraham, now we don't only have a family, but now we have a nation. So, through Abraham came all the patriarchs, the builders of that nation. And through those patriarchs, well, we have Abraham's son, Isaac, And in Isaac, we have the promise of a land, a promised land, a promise of a land. And then in Jacob, we have this promise, this Abrahamic promise of a nation built on tribes. So we had a family first in Noah. Then we have, through Abraham and the patriarchs, we develop into tribes that unite in a nation. But the chosen people has to still grow and had to learn to depend on God. So God allowed them to fall into slavery in Egypt. And he allowed them to go into slavery for two things. The first one of them, to grow dependent, knowing, not dependent as a slavery into God, but dependent as in knowing that everything good comes from him. And second, so that they would be cocooned in a way. Even though slaves, they grew protected and they multiplied. And that started as 12 tribes became this big nation of millions. But they suffered in the slavery, that earthly slavery under Egypt. So then comes Moses. And with Moses comes freedom. That freedom from the earthly powers. Now that God has used this slavery in Egypt to grow and multiply his nation, now in Moses he brings freedom. He brings freedom. And comes another covenant under him. And now God gives us the law. Because a nation to grow cohesive runs under the same law. And he gives us a God-given law. So with Moses comes the freedom from the Egyptian slavery. But then God still understands that his chosen people is not ready yet. That his chosen people still now needs to mature. They have spent too much time relying on the Egyptians to provide. So now they have to learn on trusting God to provide. So he sends them in this exodus, in this journey, this 40-year journey through the desert. He sends the whole of his people in this big spiritual journey so that they all learn that God is the one who provides. And as long as we trust in him, we will never want. And at the end of those 40 years, God makes good on his promise and allows his people to enter the promised land of Canaan, the promised land of Israel. And this happens under Joshua. And so the whole of the chosen people enter into the promised land now. And now we have this nation in their land, ready to thrive as long as they stay faithful to God. And that's the trick. They don't. They have ups and downs. Sounds like our life, doesn't it? They have ups and downs. And so they move closer and farther from God. So they move closer and farther from his blessings. And that takes time again. And they start growing. This nation grows together, first led by judges in times of need. And then they are led by kings. And then it comes the quintessential king, David. And in David, a man after God's own heart, that this nation becomes a kingdom. You see, first we had a family. First a couple, Adam and Eve, a family under Noah. Then we move into a nation under Abraham and the patriarchs. And now we move into a kingdom under David. And God makes yet another covenant, now with David. And now God promises an everlasting kingdom, as long as David's family remains faithful to him. And you guessed it, they don't. So they have ups and downs again. God's chosen people are not ready yet. So, as they have ups and downs and they move closer and farther from God, God waits. God waits for the right time to fulfill his Davidic promise. And Israel sins, and they are divided, and they are exiled. And then they come back, but no longer being that powerful unit under God, but they came again limping. And they were vulnerable. They had good and bad kings. And they moved closer and repented, and they pulled away again. And that continued. And they came under the tyranny of other powers. Assyria, Babylonia, and finally Rome. And Rome crushed them. And it is then, at that moment, in the darkest, the worst of times, and it is in that darkest of times that God decides, my people are ready now. And it is in that darkness that by God's loving design, at the fullness of times, the dawn breaks upon us who were walking in darkness. And it is at that time that God makes his final move. He stops revealing himself through prophets, and he reveals himself in his own Son. At that moment, the eternal Word becomes flesh. The Creator becomes creation. The eternal becomes finite. God humiliates, humbles himself to the point of stooping down and becoming one of us. So inferior, the Almighty becomes weak, like us. Because he decides at that moment that he would fully enter history. Fully enter history, not just through revealing his word and his spirit, but revealing his own self. And he does so in Jesus. In Jesus, God takes on flesh, and God shows us his face. In Jesus, God reveals us his own reality. In Jesus, we receive the fullness of revelation, because once God reveals himself in his Son, There's nothing else for him to say. And Jesus comes to the world to fulfill what his name means. God saves. And so he enters into our history as a babe, and he grows up dependent from his parents, dependent from creation. Look at that, the creator dependent on his own creation to grow, to be fed, to be raised. And he grows, and then at the age of 30, he teaches, and he takes on his role and mission for which his father sent him. And he brings the good news to us that the kingdom is at hand because the king is with us. And then he makes the boldest of moves. And in order to defeat death that got us under its grip, he allows himself to be killed. And in order to bring life back to us, he rises himself from the death. And that is the greatest of news. That God became flesh like us, so that he would die for us, and through his death to conquer death. And then that he would rise back to life, so that in his resurrection he would fill us with his divine life. And Jesus promised to stay present with us. That was 2,000 years ago. For 2,000 years, the battle has been won. For 2,000 years, Christ has defeated death. For 2,000 years, he has provided salvation for us. And since then, through the church he founded and the Spirit he imbued into his church, we continue the work of Christ. We continue making that salvation that he won for us 2,000 years ago present in our now and in our here. Because the church that he founded under the rock, that firm rock of his apostles, that church he founded in which he infused the power of his Spirit, he continues present. And he continues present in us so that we can live his life, and so that he can be present to all of the world. And so, in us, his mission continues of spreading the good news, and through his church, to bring sanctification to the world. And that's the best of news. And as you see, in Christ, every promise is fulfilled. The promise to Adam, which was to bring him back to Eden, he fulfilled even more by bringing the heavenly land. The promise to Noah of not destroying the earth, he fulfilled in excess by bringing to us and the eternal heavens. The promise to Abraham of a blessing, he fulfilled more by bringing not only blessings, but the blessed one. The promise to Moses of a law, he brought not only the law, but the word himself. And the promise to David of an everlasting kingdom, he gave us much more than that, because he brought to us the King himself.